If you've been following this war through headlines alone, you've probably absorbed a version of this conflict that's radically smaller than what's actually happened on the ground and in the numbers. A strike here, a retaliation there, a blockade, a ceasefire that collapses, another round of strikes. That's the shape most people carry around in their heads. But when you actually sit down and pull together the real numbers, the casualty counts, the economic damage assessments, the global ripple effects, the picture that emerges is dramatically worse than the drip feed of individual headlines ever conveys. This isn't a contained regional skirmish that occasionally makes the news for a night or two before fading away. This is, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most destructive conflicts of the last several decades, and most people watching it unfold have no idea just how bad the actual totals really are. So let's actually do the accounting properly, because this is a story that requires pulling together numbers from multiple independent sources, rather than repeating a single headline figure and calling it complete. We're going to walk through the human toll first, because that's the part that matters most and the part that's hardest to pin down, given how much fog surrounds reporting from inside Iran itself. Then we're going to get into the economic devastation, both what this has cost Iran directly and what it's cost the entire global economy. Because those numbers are honestly staggering once you see them laid out together. We'll talk about the toll on healthcare and civilian infrastructure specifically, because that's a dimension of this war that gets far less attention than it deserves, given how directly it will shape recovery for years to come. And then we'll get into the roundup and the strategic picture, because understanding just how enormous this conflict actually is changes how you should think about where it goes from here and how urgently the world should be treating it. If you're finding this kind of comprehensive breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments which of these numbers actually surprised you most, because I think for most people, it's going to be more than one. Let's start with the human cost, because this is where the fog of war creates the most genuine difficulty, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty up front, rather than presenting a single clean number as though it's beyond dispute or debate. Multiple independent tracking organizations have been compiling casualty figures throughout this conflict, and they don't fully agree with each other, which is exactly what you'd expect given Iran's internet restrictions, limited press access, and the ongoing succession crisis following the loss of senior leadership early in the war. Human rights activists in Iran, a U.S.-based organization known by the acronym HARANA, documented 3,736 total deaths inside Iran as of early April, broken down into 1,701 civilians, 1,221 military personnel, and 714 people, whose status couldn't be confirmed either way. Iran's own Ministry of Health separately reported at least 3,168 people killed in that same early window, describing victims ranging in age from 8 months old to 88 years old, including 7 infants, 376 children, and 496 women. American and Israeli estimates, by contrast, have put Iranian deaths considerably higher, at 6,000 or more, reflecting the reality that each side has real incentives to shape these numbers in different directions. Iran tends to minimize military losses while emphasizing civilian casualties, and American and Israeli sources tend to claim broader operational success. Layer in the fighting that's continued well beyond that early window, and cross-source compiled totals across every country touched by this conflict have put the overall death toll somewhere between roughly 7,000 and as high as 18,000 or more, with tens of thousands more injured. Even taking the more conservative end of that range seriously, we are talking about a death toll in the thousands, spread across Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, the United States, and multiple Gulf states from a conflict that a huge portion of the international audience still mentally files under isolated strikes and periodic ceasefires rather than what it actually is. A sustained multi-country war with a human cost rivaling some of the deadliest regional conflicts of recent memory. It's worth understanding why that range is so wide, because the gap between 7,000 and 18,000 isn't just sloppy record keeping. It reflects fundamentally different methodologies and fundamentally different access constraints, facing each organization trying to track this war. Independent human rights groups operating from outside Iran, like Prana and Hengao, rely heavily on networks of local contacts, hospital sources, and social media verification. Methods that tend to undercount because so much information simply can't get out given Iran's internet restrictions and press access limitations. Iran's own government sources, like its Foundation of Martyrs and Veterans Affairs, have their own incentives to present a controlled, lower figure that doesn't draw attention to the scale of military losses specifically, since Iran has consistently been more transparent about civilian deaths than military ones throughout this conflict. And American and Israeli government estimates, sitting at the high end of the range with figures of 6,000 or more just for Iranian deaths alone, carry their own incentive to demonstrate operational effectiveness to domestic and international audiences. None of these sources are necessarily lying outright. They're each counting through a different lens. with different access, different incentives, and different definitions of what counts as a war-related death in the first place, which is exactly why any responsible accounting has to present the full range rather than picking whichever single number is most convenient to cite. There's also a separate, deeply significant Kurdish human rights organization worth mentioning here, Hengal, based in Norway, which documented at least 7,650 people killed during what it specifically characterized as the initial 40-day phase of the war alone, of which the organization found only 13.5%, or about 1,030 people, were civilians, with the remaining majority, more than 6,600 people, being military personnel. That specific breakdown, showing military deaths dramatically outnumbering civilian deaths in Hengal's accounting, differs sharply from other trackers that show civilian and military deaths much closer to parity. And that discrepancy itself is worth sitting with because it illustrates just how much the final picture depends on which specific organization, with which specific access, and which specific verification standard you happen to be citing at any given moment. And here's a detail that deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it complicates the entire moral framing of this war in a way that rarely makes it into casual coverage. Before the American and Israeli strikes ever began at the end of February, Iran's own government had already been carrying out mass killings of its own protesters. Following the collapse of the rial and record inflation in late 2025, anti-government protests spread to more than 200 cities across the country, and the resulting crackdown by Iranian security forces resulted in what's been described as the largest killings in modern Iranian history, with official death toll estimates in the thousands, and some reporting, including from Time magazine, suggesting as many as 30,000 civilians may have been killed by their own government before this war with the United States and Israel even started. That context matters enormously because it means Iran's healthcare system, its emergency services, and its overall capacity to absorb mass casualties were already devastated and overwhelmed before a single American or Israeli missile ever landed, which helps explain why the humanitarian toll of everything that's followed has been so much more severe than a similarly sized conflict might have produced against a country entering the fighting with its civil infrastructure fully intact. Let's talk about the healthcare and civilian infrastructure dimension specifically, because this is genuinely one of the more underreported aspects of this entire war, and it rarely gets the same attention as strike footage or troop movements, even though its long-term consequences may end up mattering just as much. According to the Iranian Red Crescent, more than 300 health, medical, and emergency care facilities had been damaged as of early April alone. Some of the specific incidents documented are genuinely difficult to sit with. An in vitro fertilization clinic at a hospital was struck and seriously damaged on just the second day of strikes, severely injuring a healthcare worker and devastating parents who had embryos and reproductive materials stored in that facility. Pregnant women across affected regions have been forced to give birth in unsafe conditions, without essential medical services, and at times, without electricity entirely. Iran's first and largest pharmaceutical raw materials research company was hit by drones early in the conflict, an event with implications that extend well beyond the immediate strike itself, because damage to pharmaceutical production and research infrastructure creates downstream medicine shortages that can affect vulnerable patients for months or years after the physical rubble gets cleared away. When you combine that kind of healthcare infrastructure damage with a population that was already reeling from a mass killing of protesters just weeks earlier, you get a humanitarian emergency layered on top of an active war, each crisis compounding the other rather than existing as separate sequential problems. Now, let's move to the economic devastation, because the scale here is genuinely difficult to fully process even when you're looking directly at the figures. Iran's own government assessments have put war-related economic losses at somewhere between $140 and $145 billion after just the first 6 weeks of fighting, a figure that only grew from there. More recent reporting from Iran's own Islamic Revolution Housing Foundation, working through state media, estimated damage specifically to residential units, commercial premises, and personal belongings across the country, excluding Tehran entirely, at more than 37 trillion tomans, or roughly $196 billion. That figure comes from more than 140,000 separate damage assessment files opened so far, spanning 25 Iranian provinces and covering 407 separate cities and villages. And remember, that figure explicitly excludes Tehran, excludes infrastructure damage, excludes industrial and military facility losses entirely, meaning the true, comprehensive economic toll on Iran specifically is almost certainly dramatically higher than even that staggering figure suggests. Think about what a damage assessment process at this scale actually looks like in practice, because 140,000 individual files represents 140,000 separate households, businesses and families each having to document, prove, and submit claims for property they've lost. in a country where government bureaucracy was already strained before this war even began, and where huge portions of the country's administrative capacity have themselves been diverted toward the war effort, or degraded by the same strikes that damaged the property being claimed in the first place. That bureaucratic backlog alone tells you that even once fighting eventually stops, the practical process of Iranian families actually receiving compensation or rebuilding assistance is going to stretch on for years, simply due to the sheer administrative volume involved, setting aside entirely whether the Iranian government will even have the financial resources available to fund meaningful compensation once all those files are finally processed. Let's zoom out from Iran specifically to the global economic picture, because this is where the true scale of this conflict becomes impossible to dismiss as a contained regional problem. The Institute for Economics and Peace estimated that this war has been reducing global GDP by roughly $2.2 trillion annually, a figure the organization itself noted could climb even higher if the conflict continues facing obstacles to resolution. The mechanism behind that staggering number traces directly back to the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway just over 20 miles wide at its narrowest point that normally carries around 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products every single day, something in the neighborhood of 1/5 of global petroleum consumption and more than 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade. When Iran closed that strait in early March, the head of the International Energy Agency described the resulting disruption as the greatest energy security challenge in history, with roughly 13 million barrels a day of Gulf exports stranded almost overnight. Saudi Arabia and the UAE managed to redirect a combined 7 million barrels a day through alternative pipelines that don't depend on the strait, but that still left an enormous shortfall, described as the largest supply disruption ever recorded in the global oil market, with countries like Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain having no alternative export route available to them at all. That disruption sent oil prices surging past $100 a barrel, eventually reaching around $110 by mid-May, compared to prices that had more consistently hovered between $67 and $71 before the conflict began. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely unusual compared to previous oil shocks in modern history. In nearly every prior disruption like this one, rising prices at least meant a windfall for the producing nations themselves. This time, because of the disruption was tied directly to active warfare rather than simple supply and demand dynamics, that windfall never materialized the way it normally would, with the nations actually capable of exporting oil unable to fully capitalize on higher prices given the surrounding chaos, sanctions, and blockade enforcement, while ordinary consumers around the world absorbed the pain of higher prices without the usual offsetting benefit flowing back to producer economies in any stabilizing way. Let's bring this down to what it's actually meant for ordinary Americans, because abstract trillion-dollar global figures can be hard to feel in any personal way. According to Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi, as of late July, the cumulative costs of this war, spanning military spending, higher interest rates, and higher costs for gas, groceries, and other transportation, amounted to more than $1,200 per American household. Gas and diesel prices specifically have run roughly 37% and 45% higher respectively than they were before the war started, with the national average price for regular gasoline sitting at $4.09 a gallon in mid-August, compared to just $2.98 the day before the conflict began. 13 separate states had regular gas prices above $4.30 a gallon by that same point. That's not an abstract geopolitical statistic. That's money coming directly out of household budgets across the entire country. Every single time someone fills up their car or buys groceries that had to be transported using more expensive fuel. There's also a military cost to the United States specifically that deserves its own attention, because it reveals just how resource-intensive this conflict has been, even setting aside the human and civilian economic toll entirely. Harvard Kennedy School professor Linda Bilmes noted back in April that the United States fired more Patriot missiles in just the first 4 days of this war than it had provided to Ukraine over the entire previous 4 years of that separate conflict combined. Think about that comparison for a second. 4 days of expenditure in this one theater exceeding 4 full years of support to an entirely different, extensively covered war. Senator Mark Kelly told CBS's Face the Nation that replenishing depleted American munitions stockpiles could take years, a timeline defense experts have corroborated independently, with restocking a single Tomahawk missile costing somewhere between $3 and $3.5 million each. Multiply that kind of per-unit cost across the volume of munitions actually expended throughout this conflict, and you start to understand why estimates of the total direct American military cost of this war have run into the hundreds of billions of dollars, funding that flows directly to defense contractors building replacement munitions, work that will keep American production lines running for years, specifically to rebuild stockpiles this conflict has drawn down. Let's talk about the human toll extending beyond Iran itself. because this war has never been contained to a purely bilateral exchange between the United States and Iran, and treating it that way dramatically understates the actual scope of what's happened. Lebanon has recorded more than 4,000 people killed and over 12,000 injured since fighting. They're escalated in early March. Figures compiled by Al Jazeera from Lebanon's own health ministry, numbers that, in some tallies, exceed even the confirmed death toll inside Iran itself. Iraq has recorded well over 100 people killed, including a single strike in late July that killed at least 20 Popular Mobilization Forces fighters and wounded 32 others. Israel has recorded 57 deaths and nearly 9,000 injuries. Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman, have all recorded their own casualties from Iranian drone and missile attacks, with fatalities in the double digits across several of these countries, even though no single comprehensive regional casualty count has ever been fully compiled and published. As recently as June, 3 Indian sailors died simply crewing oil tankers caught up in the fighting in the Strait of Hormuz, a reminder that the human cost of this conflict has reached ordinary civilian workers with no direct stake in the underlying dispute at all, from countries that aren't even active parties to the war. It's worth pausing on that Lebanon figure specifically, because a death toll exceeding 4,000 people in a country that isn't even the primary combatant in this war is a genuinely staggering statistic that rarely gets the attention it deserves in coverage focused primarily on the U.S. Iran dimension of the conflict. Lebanon's involvement traces back to Hezbollah's own entanglement with Iran and the broader regional proxy network this war activated almost immediately once fighting began, and the resulting toll on ordinary Lebanese civilians who had no direct say whatsoever in the decisions that dragged their country into this conflict, represents exactly the kind of secondary, cascading human cost that a war of this scale inevitably produces once it starts pulling in regional proxy relationships that have existed for decades. A single day in mid-August alone, with 11 people killed in strikes on 2 Lebanese towns, stood as the deadliest single day in that country since an earlier arrangement in June had briefly calmed things down, illustrating just how volatile and how far from truly resolved this secondary front of the war has remained, even during stretches when the primary U.S.-Iran exchange itself has gone quiet. American service members have paid a real price throughout this conflict as well, and it's worth stating the numbers plainly rather than letting them blur into an abstract wartime statistic. 18 American service members have been confirmed killed as of early August, with at least another 624 wounded. The Pentagon has notably failed to provide regular, consistent updates on these casualty figures, and hasn't attributed casualties occurring after the mid-June ceasefire agreement specifically to this war, a gap in official reporting that itself becomes part of the broader story here, because it makes the true, complete toll on American forces harder for the public to track with confidence, even months into an active, ongoing conflict that continues generating fresh casualties on a fairly regular basis. Let's move into the roundup section for a moment, because there are a few additional threads worth connecting here that reinforce just how expansive this conflict's true footprint has become. Housing damage inside Iran has been documented across 25 separate provinces, with officials specifically noting that provinces like Elam, Kermanshah, and Kurdistan were hit hardest, regions that notably overlap significantly with areas where the Kurdish insurgency we've discussed in other contexts has been most active, suggesting these communities are absorbing both the direct costs of foreign airstrikes and the ongoing costs of domestic insurgent conflict simultaneously. Earlier reporting from the Iranian Red Crescent Society documented more than 82,000 civilian structures damaged or destroyed just within the first month of fighting, a figure that has almost certainly grown substantially in the many months since that early assessment. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as early as late March, publicly described the war as, in his own words, out of control, appointing a dedicated personal envoy specifically to lead mediation efforts, a level of direct UN intervention that itself signals just how seriously the international community assessed the trajectory of this conflict from a very early stage. Now, let's get into the strategic picture, because understanding the true scale of this war fundamentally changes how you should think about its trajectory and its eventual resolution. Think about the difference between how this conflict is typically consumed through periodic news coverage versus what the actual compiled data reveals. A headline about a single night of strikes, or a single ceasefire violation, or a single naval interception reads as an incremental update to an ongoing situation. But when you step back and add up months of these incremental updates, thousands of deaths, hundreds of billions in direct economic damage, trillions in global economic disruption, hundreds of damaged healthcare facilities, tens of thousands of damaged homes, you're looking at a conflict whose true magnitude has been almost systematically obscured by the very format most people use to follow it. Daily or weekly news coverage is simply not well suited to conveying cumulative scale, It's built around discrete events, and discrete events, however individually significant, don't naturally add up in most people's minds the way a comprehensive accounting like this one forces them to. That gap between perceived scale and actual scale has real consequences for how this war gets discussed, debated, and ultimately resolved. A conflict that the public perceives as a contained, manageable series of skirmishes generates a very different level of political pressure than a conflict the public correctly understands as one of the most economically and humanly costly wars of the past several decades. If more people genuinely grasped that this war has cost the average American household over $1,000, that it's caused a death toll rivaling or exceeding other major conflicts, that receive far more sustained public attention, that it's damaged healthcare infrastructure, to the point of forcing women to give birth without electricity, the political calculus around continuing versus resolving this conflict would likely look considerably different than it currently does. Wars sustain themselves partly through the public's incomplete understanding of their true cost. And every gap in comprehensive reporting, every casualty figure that gets buried in a specialized tracking database rather than surfaced prominently in mainstream coverage contributes to that gap persisting longer than it probably should. There's a useful comparison worth drawing here to how other major conflicts have been perceived by the public relative to their actual documented scale, because this isn't a phenomenon unique to this particular war. Historically, conflicts that unfold gradually through a steady drip of individually modest-seeming updates tend to accumulate public tolerance in a way that a single equivalent catastrophic event never would. If the full casualty and economic toll of this war had been announced all at once on a single day, as a single comprehensive summary, the public and political reaction would almost certainly have been far more immediate and far more forceful than the reaction that's actually developed over these many months of incremental headlines. That's not a criticism of any single news outlet or reporting failure. It's simply an observation about how human attention and political urgency respond very differently to gradual accumulation versus sudden, complete revelation. And it's exactly why a comprehensive accounting like the one we've just walked through matters, because it forces that sudden, complete revelation that months of incremental coverage never quite manages to deliver on its own. There's also something worth saying about the specific dynamic of dueling casualty figures and the uncertainty surrounding them, because that uncertainty itself has strategic value to certain parties. When death tolls range as widely as they do here, from roughly 7,000 on the low end to 18,000 or more on the high end, that range creates enough ambiguity for any party in this conflict to selectively cite whichever figure best supports their preferred narrative. Iran can point to its own more conservative foundation of martyrs, count to downplay the war's toll domestically. American and Israeli sources can point to higher independent estimates when it serves their narrative of operational effectiveness. That kind of number shopping, made possible by genuine, honest uncertainty in the underlying data, is exactly why serious tracking organizations increasingly present these figures as verified ranges with explicit confidence flags rather than single definitive totals. And it's exactly why any responsible accounting of this war's true cost has to resist the temptation to cite whichever single number sounds most dramatic or most reassuring, and instead present the honest range along with the reasons that range exists in the first place. It's also worth thinking about what this level of cumulative devastation means for whatever comes after this war eventually winds down, however and whenever that actually happens. A country facing somewhere between $140 and nearly $200 billion in direct property and infrastructure damage, on top of a healthcare system already overwhelmed before the fighting even started, on top of hundreds of thousands of individual damage claims still being processed, is not a country that simply returns to its pre-war baseline once the ceasefire finally holds. Reconstruction on this scale, assuming Iran even retains the economic capacity to fund it independently given how thoroughly its oil export revenue has been strangled throughout this conflict, would likely take the better part of a decade, under even reasonably optimistic assumptions. And that's setting aside the political and leadership reconstruction required after losing so much of its senior military and security establishment in the war's opening days. The scale of destruction documented here isn't just a wartime statistic. It's a preview of the kind of prolonged, difficult recovery period that will likely define this region's reality for years after the shooting itself eventually stops. So where does this actually leave things right now? The true scope of this conflict, once you actually assemble the full picture rather than tracking it one headline at a time, reveals a war that's caused thousands of deaths across at least half a dozen countries, hundreds of billions of dollars in direct damage to Iran alone, trillions of dollars in disruption to the global economy, and a humanitarian toll on healthcare and civilian infrastructure that will likely produce consequences extending years beyond whatever date the fighting itself eventually ends. That's a fundamentally different story than the one most casual observers of this conflict are carrying around in their heads, and closing that gap between perception and reality matters, not just for accurately understanding history as it's happening, but for grasping just how much genuinely is at stake in how and when this war finally comes to a close. It's also worth acknowledging, in the interest of intellectual honesty, that a comprehensive accounting like this one can never be fully complete, given how much of what's happened inside Iran specifically remains obscured by internet restrictions, limited press access, and a succession crisis that continues affecting how reliably any information flows out of the country at all. Every figure presented here represents the best available compilation from credible cross-referenced sources at this point in time, not a final definitive tally that will never need revision. If anything, that persistent uncertainty is itself part of the story. A war this consequential, touching this many countries and this many lives, and we still don't have anything close to a fully agreed upon, universally verified accounting of its true cost, which says something important about how difficult it remains to hold any of the parties involved fully accountable for the scale of what's actually happened. What do you think happens next? Now that you've seen the full scope of the actual numbers behind this conflict, does it change how you think about how urgently this war needs to end? Or do you think the scale of destruction we've walked through today has already reached a point where meaningful de-escalation is going to be difficult regardless of how much international pressure builds in the months ahead? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I think this comprehensive accounting is exactly the kind of context that gets lost in day-to-day coverage, and it deserves to be part of how people actually understand this war, rather than a footnote buried in a specialized tracker nobody outside a small circle of analysts ever actually reads. If this breakdown helped you grasp just how much bigger this conflict actually is than the headlines usually convey, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed sourced analysis reach more people who deserve the full picture rather than a fragmented one pieced together from whatever happens to trend on a given day. Subscribe if you want to keep getting this kind of comprehensive accounting as this war continues to develop, because the true scale of what's happening here deserves ongoing, serious attention rather than just periodic headline updates that never quite add up to the full picture on their own. And if you know someone who's been following this war casually and has no idea just how enormous the actual human and economic toll has become, share this with them, because everyone following this conflict deserves to understand its true scale, not just the fragments that happen to trend on any given day. And the more people who see the full picture, the harder it becomes for that true cost to stay buried under a drip feed of incremental headlines. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.